Hi, everyone. It looks like we've hit the 2 o'clock Eastern mark. So for the sake of considering all your time, I'd love to get things started. And of course, we'll let people trickle in. And if at any moment you might have to jump off, take that call, we know you're busy. We will be sending follow-up materials and recording this, so you'll be able to catch up later. So just to get started, first of all, welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for joining. We're really excited to talk about MDOT's, MTA's overhaul, their schedule overhaul for their recent winter pick. We're really excited to dig in. So to get started, here's a look at our agenda. We'll start with some very brief introductions so that you get to know our panelists today. And then I'll be guiding conversation around a couple questions that we have for Michael and Tom. And after that, we will jump directly into audience question and answer. So we have some functionality within the webinar software that will allow you to ask us questions. And throughout the course of things, if something comes up you think it might be relevant for folks on the call today, throw it in the Q&A section, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can in our time together. So just to test that out, you should see a section called Q&A, or a button that says Q&A on the bottom of your screen. If you go ahead and click that, I would love to just throw out a practice question, which is, where are you joining from today? So let's go ahead and do that now, just so we can test that functionality and make sure that everyone can ask questions that wants to. I see some question in the Q&A. We're seeing Pennsylvania, we're seeing Denton. This is great, so thank you. Got a good mix of folks on the call. So let's jump right in. Starting with introductions, I'm going to let our panelists at MTA introduce themselves. So go ahead, Michael.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody, or morning, depending on where you are. My name is Mike Helta. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer here at MDOT MTA. I concentrate on a lot of initiatives to improve the customer experience. And obviously, a big part of the customer experience is real-time information and whether or not your vehicle shows up on time. So I'm really excited to kind of share some of the stuff we've learned throughout this process in coordination with Swiftly, and kind of looking forward to some Q&A afterwards.
Hey everyone, I'm Tom Hewitt. I'm Director of Service Development for the Maryland Transit Administration. My department deals with service planning and scheduling. Using Swiftly, was a big, help for us on both sides of that. And I know we're going to go into the scheduling aspect in detail, but yeah, we do all the bus routes, bus stops, and the schedules for our 65 routes.
Thanks, you both. I'm Meredith Bordoni. I'm the head of product at Swiftly, and my role basically consists of listening to folks at various transit agencies to identify shared problems and to make sure that we're building solutions to those problems that are really helpful. So to set just a little bit of context before we dive right into the content, Swiftly and MTA have been working together for upwards of 1.5 years now. And I think through the course of the content in the webinar, you'll find out a little bit more about the capacity in which we've been working together, but wanted to throw that out there. So let's dive right in. Let's get started. To set the stage a bit, Michael, I would love for you to tell us just at a high level, a little bit more about your network, ridership, vehicle count, what's happening, and maybe what are the key focus areas for your administration right now?
Sure. So we're, the Maryland Department of Transportation's Maryland Transit Administration, official name MDOT MTA for short. We operate service throughout the state of Maryland for commuter rail and commuter bus. And we also operate all of the local transit for the Baltimore metropolitan region. So we have 6 operating modes: local bus, commuter rail, commuter bus, a light rail system, a metro system, and we also operate the region's paratransit or mobility service. We have about roughly 100 million rides a year. About 2/3 to 3/4 of those, depending on the day, ride on our bus service. We're the 13th largest transit system in the country. there's some other stuff on the screen here that you guys can read. We also do a lot of the pass-through funding for all the locally operated transit systems throughout the entire state. So we provide a lot of pass-through funding for that. Operating budget around $850 million a year, and our 6-year capital budget's about 3.3, 3.4 billion that we manage. And so since a lot of the stuff that we've done with Swiftly is primarily bus focused, I wanted to provide a little more insight to our local bus service. We currently have 3 tiers: of CityLink, which is our high frequency service; Local Link, which is kind of your fill in the gap or more neighborhood crosstown services; and your Express Bus Link, which is your peak time service. Average ridership around 210K a week. About 750 buses in the fleet. We operate out of 4 divisions throughout the region. This is our main heavy hauler for our transit service throughout the Baltimore region. So much so that, in fact, about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, we completely redid the entire system under a project called Baltimore Link. So I kind of want to jump into that to kind of set the stage as to how we started working with Swiftly. So kind of the crux of the entire service is, like I said, CityLink's the frequent service. Every single one of those routes, there's 12 of them, are 24-hour service. They all run on a high frequency basis, at least every 15 minutes from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. at night. Local links fill in the neighborhoods. Express Link is your skip stop service. So not only did we reorganize and renumber and reroute kind of all of our services to turn on overnight in June of 2017, we also did a ton of infrastructure improvements. Next slide. So we put in about 5 miles of dedicated bus lanes. We put in transit signal priority on 2 of our major corridors and installed it on 250 of our buses. We've since installed that on the rest of our 750 buses, and we're looking to put TSP on a few other corridors in the city. We did a lot of bus stop optimization, removing, I think, 10 to 20% of our stops across the entire system. We created all new bus stop signs, about 4,200 of them, so that you have more information when you're out of the system. We, updated our shelters. We put in some new transfer facilities and a whole ton of other stuff. So when we went to launch this, one of the questions was we were moving to a frequency-based system for those CityLink routes. And we asked ourselves how we were going to manage those. And we didn't really have a good answer, because our current CAD AVL system only let us see 60 to 70% of our buses at any given time. And it only reported every 2 to 4 minutes. And so how do you manage a frequency-based headway when you're not even sure if you can see all your buses? So luckily we came across Swiftly. It was very timely. And we were able to get with them and get trackers on 1/3 of our fleet, the fleet that was going to be kind of reserved for that CityLink service. We got those in place for launch. And it was a big success. People really liked internally the capability to manage our system, so much so that, in fact, that it was a no-brainer for us to expand this out to the rest of the fleet, which we were able to do. I think as of last February, a year ago, we were able to get it installed on everything. And so as we did all this, redid the routes, redid all the infrastructure, we saw some initial improvements in on-time performance, because that was a major issue with our system. We got up to, I think, about the mid 60%, which still isn't very good, but it was an improvement, unbelievably so, over what we used to have. So we have all this stuff in place. We redid the routes. We're feeling good about that. And kind of the big elephant in the room was how we were going to continue to improve, like looking at our schedules and what are we going to do with all this new data. And that kind of brings us to kind of the big point of what we're talking about today. So Tom can go into some of that. But I just want to kind of set a stage as to where we're at, who we are, and kind of how we've gotten here today.
Thanks so much, Mike. That was great. And because this is a service planning oriented group, I think it's appropriate to jump to Tom and let him flesh out a little bit more about the process there. So to schedule for that many routes while aligning your work with kind of these broad organizational goals, Tom, can you shed some light on how your team has historically done scheduling? So where you were, and what software you had at your disposal, and what your approach was just by default?
Yeah. So with Baltimore Link, one of the main points was realigning the routes to make them be follow our guiding principles. We want to have safe, efficient, reliable service with world-class customer service. And Baltimore Link really set the foundation for that But out of that, the reliability component is crucial in transit. To gain ridership, to retain ridership, we have to make sure we have a reliable system. And, that's really based on the schedules we create. But when we create schedules, they're only as good as the data that we have going into the system. And, we see the timetables and the schedules as a contract with our riders. And previously, like Mike was saying, using the CAD AVL system, the data quality was just poor, but that was really the best, information we had. We use ride checkers, but that's only, for NTD reporting, so they don't go out all the time, very, very small sample for the ride checks, but we were using our CAD AVL data. And again, it was just the quality of data was not there, so the schedules were hurting as a result. Kind of from there, we looked at looking into different methods. So we looked at our APC system, which then had our automatic passenger counters, which has a functionality to help out with run times and help improve the schedule. But again, it's the number of samples that we were getting. A sample size for NTD reporting for passenger counts is acceptable number, but it wouldn't be acceptable for using the data for the run times. So we still had issues with the quality of data and the sample size. And service planning and scheduling is all about process. The previous systems were poor quality, and the analysis that we had to do with those systems was time consuming. So not only did we have, a poor quality data, but it took many months, 2-3 months to really go through this data and kind of sift out the outliers and really get information that we could then put into our schedule. So I guess going through, it was using our information from our APC system was one of the most recent ways, and that we would just be using averages based on standard deviations. But again, it wasn't really working to our liking, and reliability was hurting as a result.
Wow. So historically, you're using kind of sample data that may not be up to your standard, and you were looking at average run times to drive schedule changes. And I know that recently your team started thinking about runtime analysis a little bit differently. Can you elaborate a bit on the evolution of the methodology specifically?
Yeah, sure. So like I said, when I first came aboard almost 3 years ago, we were really just using the CAD AVL system, and we knew we had to change. So we went to the APC system, which was problematic in its own right, but we started to look at the specific analysis. So not just using the data and using averages, but looking at how some peers or some other transit agencies were kind of slicing and dicing their data. And through our research, we actually looked at a UTA, Utah Agent Transit Agency, and kind of their methodology to look at the most number of samples within a given range of times and kind of use that number. So, remember, when we have schedules, you don't want to be, too late, but you also don't want to be too early. And with operators, there's a lot of variability with how they run their routes. It's human nature. Operators are going to run routes a little differently on the same route. So we wanted to make sure we had a good number that allowed to improve the reliability. So we piloted this methodology that we used with the Utah method, but it was very time consuming. We can only do about 5 routes. And again, it didn't really yield the results that we wanted to. About this same time is when we really started working closely with you and the other folks at Swiftly, and getting the units aboard our buses, starting to get that data in from our CityLink lines, and then eventually all of our routes and all of our 750 buses. We were getting a treasure trove of data, but the problem with that was it was like drinking from a fire hose. We could look at the trip level information, we could look at the stop level information, but from a scheduling perspective, we need to look at a larger sample, but also a longer duration of sample data. And when we're building schedules together, we look at it at the time point and by the time band. So a node to node rather than a stop to stop, and within our time bands, and not necessarily individual trip level. So that was really kind of where we came to Swiftly, and Mike and I were working with folks at Swiftly to get the data in a format that was more digestible for our scheduling staff, and something that we could then quickly put into our schedules and make those changes.
Wonderful, thank you. So you started to shift your methodology, and you're right, Swiftly released a runtimes module kind of around the same time. And I know that was like drinking from a fire hose, as you put it. It still required heavy data crunching, still required putting things into the node pair format for you all. And so to address that pain point, we recently released the runtime suggestions view. And so that uses that real world trip data to infer the optimal segment time. As a close partner with Swiftly MTA, you all got early access to that. And can you share a little bit just about what you've been doing with that? It's an updated module, and you all obviously have more experience than most with it. What has it enabled for you?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the runtime module for us was really a game changer in how we looked at making changes to our schedules. It allowed us to enhance the reliability, improve on the reliability much quicker because that analysis component wasn't there. So stuff that was taking us a few months really took us a few clicks, and we're able to look at routes and see the impact of that potential schedule change. And we utilized it for our current pick. So we were looking at data from February, or I should say from the fall, so September and October, because as many people on this webinar can attest, the run times and putting that into the beginning part of the scheduling process, you have to do that upfront, because then you start to establish your trips, then you build your blocks, and you do your run cut and all that. So we really have to have this early on, and it was something where we can then assess the information that we received from the suggested schedule module, and we could see really where we can make the most changes and get the most bang for our buck. So, as we mentioned before, we were able to look at 41 routes for the current winter pick when we were doing the schedule change back in February. I mean, that's much greater than the 5 to 10 routes that we were looking at previously. In addition to that, so not only the 41 routes, but when you start to look at the individual time bands and the node pairs and the segment level and the overall level run times, that was huge because we can see getting our bang for our buck and seeing the improvements that we can potentially see with our reliability if we make these changes. So it's not just adding runtime, it's recalibrating. Something as simple as shifting the time. Maybe a bus is getting early to one, between one node pair, but late in the next, and you can still shift a few minutes here and there, but the overall runtime is the same. Then that means we're not putting out additional resources, because like every transit agency, we have limitations in our resources, both operators and buses. And we can go into the data and see what the on-time performance currently is, and also what the potential might be with these changes, and make these decisions a lot faster than we did previously. And so I can go to the administrator and say, hey, we may need a couple more blocks because we're going to be adding runtime and it doesn't fit into the current cycle. So we're going to have to add a few more blocks, but we can see the on-time performance potentially go up to, up 10 percentage points or 15 percentage points. And that was a case that we can make that then it's justified, saying that, okay, I'm not going to get yelled at for adding additional resource requirements, because the result is a more reliable schedule for our riders and even our operators.
Wonderful, thank you. So I briefly showcased one of the MTA routes up here within the suggested runtimes view, and I'm just gonna put up kind of a recap of what you just mentioned there before moving on. So that was a really helpful understanding from the kind of service planning lens. And I'm curious if, beyond those very concrete examples that you gave of shortening the time it takes to run your analysis, of cleaning all that data and reevaluating the schedules for several routes, have you seen any additional benefits to using a tool like this with that data at your disposal beyond scheduling?
Yeah. So this is Mike again. Not being a scheduler, not being in the schedule department, scheduling it's a mystical science that it's incredibly complicated. And one thing that I really like about the tool and some of the other tools that the Swiftly dashboard provides is that it puts it in a way that even non-schedulers can understand. And so when we get calls about, or we see stuff on social media, or we get complaints about a route that's not performing, and we can start to trend that we're getting a lot of comments on this route, it's not resting on Tom's group's shoulders to go in and look at why that could be. Now we've kind of enabled a lot of other people across the agency in different departments to go into that dashboard, and they can start to explore and start to triage and identify issues that they're seeing, and then get that to Tom's group. And now, since they have a quicker way to potentially make a modification or an edit or improve the schedule, it kind of just really speeds up the entire process. But I think one of the main things that I see is that it allows others throughout the agency to be part of the solution, and to kind of pitch in to kind of get where the agency is trying to go, and that's been incredibly useful for us.
Yeah, and I think the additional benefits that I see in my group is just the allocation of resources internally. We have more time now because it cut down the amount of analysis that we had to do for the actual run times. We can look at other factors that greatly impact reliability and on-time performance. Specifically, deadhead times, non-revenue, times to get to and from the revenue points, and also layover times. I mean, I always tell people in the agency that those are the three aspects of service planning and scheduling that we are in control of. We can't control construction events and things of that nature that kind of pop up unexpectedly. But as long as we have the bus getting out of the gate and having enough time to get to the revenue point, and then using Swiftly's suggested runtime module to adjust the run times, and then using our industry, industry standard about 10 to 12% of the trip travel time as the layover, we could then really fine tune the schedules, not only from the rider side, but also operationally on the back end. So it's not that, the run times might be great, but we may give 10 minutes less of deadhead time to get to a location. And so they're always going to be running late. That first trip is always going to be 10 minutes behind. So it really frees up time for my staff to look at these other factors with scheduling. And we actually use Swiftly as well in this as well, in addition to the runtime module. So we can look at those resources. And like I said, also, we can then look and see if it's, if it's worth it to, add a bus potentially, because we're going to see we have the suggested or the proposed OTP if we make these changes. And that's really a good piece of information and evidence that I can then go to executive management and say, listen, we're going to be, potentially adding more, more buses on this route, but on-time performance can increase by, 10, 15 percentage points. And then that's worth it. And then lastly, I think, like to Mike's point, corroborating with the operators and not really planning by anecdote. So we can validate their concerns and also walk through with them, because operators don't always see what's in front of them or behind them when it comes to buses. So if there was anything like, if there was a cut trip that day, if there was an accident and they weren't aware of it yet, but then they thought that they needed more time, we could say, it was only this instance. And if you look at the average, if you look at the longer term trends, we don't really need to add time, or maybe we do. Maybe we missed this one extra node pair that we need to add a few minutes because of something that just came up. But yeah, I mean, it's just beyond the runtime module. There's other ways that we can use Swiftly in general to really enhance our schedule.
Great, thank you both. So I know it's only been a few weeks. I think your winter pick went live February 4th. If I'm not mistaken, and feel free to correct me, but are there any preliminary results that you're willing to share with the group?
Yeah, so I think a lot of us were holding our breath. I mean, I have a healthy cynic in me, regardless, because you never know with service changes and with the schedule information. And like I said earlier, we had to do this with a sample set essentially 5-6 months earlier. So a lot can change in that time, and you never know, how it's going to shake out. But we saw with this service change, which was Super Bowl Sunday. So I know Mike and I were joking around, like, 6 a.m., 5 a.m. in the morning, we were on Swiftly checking out the on-time performance almost hourly. Yep. My wife's probably, was complaining that I was checking Swiftly too much, about saying, oh, it's 9 o'clock, we're at 76%. It's
Yep.
10 o'clock, we're at 75%. We're still good. But yeah, so we've seen out of the, the routes that we've changed, we saw 26 routes that improved by at least 5 percentage points or more. So that was a huge benefit. And we're sustaining now an on-time performance in the low to mid 70s, which is unheard of, especially in the first day and the first week. Usually when the first couple days and the first week of a new pick, operators need time to adjust to their new routes. They need to get used to the schedule. So that's when we usually see the reliability at its lowest, and it slowly creeps up throughout the pick, where we might get into the high 60s and sometimes the low 70s towards the end of the pick when operators are used to their runs. But with this change, we saw immediate results. I believe the first day, that Super Bowl Sunday, we were at 75% on-time performance, which was great. And again, sustaining 71%, 72% now so far in the pick is great. And we were talking internally, but we've seen, we think, is one of the highest OTP numbers in the agency's history. For a non-holiday weekday, we achieved a 76% on-time performance for an average weekday. It wasn't a holiday. It wasn't like no one's showing up to work. It wasn't one of these snow emergencies we had, or anything like that. This was a normal average weekday where we actually got 76% on-time performance, which is huge for us.
Yeah.
Thanks. That's great news. Mike, did you have anything to add?
So I mean, Tom went to some of the numbers, and I shared some apprehension before we launched. But I mean, it's we've been working really hard at improving our on-time performance for the past year and a half, 2 years, and we had kind of hit a bit of a wall, I feel. And with this service change, it was a small amount of data that we were able to use to plan it off of. With the amount of improvement that we've seen kind of just in the first 3-4 weeks, it really gives a lot of hope for kind of future service changes and future things that we can do as an agency on the on-time performance front. It really kind of shows some of the power of what data can do, and once you get it, how do you harness it?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been incredibly positive, and there's been a lot of happier faces around the agency recently, but then a whole lot of faces that are like, all right, well, we did this, like, what are we doing next? Which is, that's a good sentiment to have.
Yeah. And to Mike's point, with the service change, with the winter service change, using only about a 6-week data set in the fall. So from September and half of October, before we had to start trip building and blocking, now we're, this was potentially the pitfall. But because we got swiftly, the units installed on all of our coaches and did the kind of cleanup in QA/QC, so we had a reliable, accurate data set. Now it's only going to get better. So for example, we had this data April, May of last year. So I know that when I look at the summer pick upcoming in June, and then subsequent picks after that, we have historical data in Swiftly that we could use a larger sample set of data. So, I know my department and folks, around the agency can see it getting even better. So this was a great starting point, but yeah, there's only room to improve and expand.
Great. And so that generally wraps up my big questions for you. So before getting to the live Q&A, I just want to ask, kind of looking towards the future, broadening things a bit, are there any other things you've learned that you'll be leveraging in the future around tools or data use, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, I think, new technology is cool when it works. And there's always a little apprehension because since we only have 3 service changes a year, it's a big deal. So if you swing and you miss, I mean, you miss hard for 3-4 months until you can fix it again. And that's always one of the difficult things I tell when I meet with riders and members of the public and elected officials, that yeah, we can look at this and change this in 4 months. And they explain to me, what the heck are you talking about? And like everyone else, or any other agencies, we have collective bargaining agreement, requirements, and we can't be changing things kind of on the fly like that. So yeah, it's getting the new tech kind of set up that we can utilize properly, and just change being hard. And like Mike said, scheduling is both an art and a science, and especially folks in my staff, being a little not resistant, but this is a new thing, and I don't want to use something that's new just because it's new. I want to use a tool that's actually effective. And I think this really, with this service change, it proved that this is something that we can go on. And now my schedulers are actively using Swiftly to kind of comb through some of these schedules themselves, and seeing where they can make improvements. And when they talk to operators, when they talk to the divisions, they can provide that information to them. So it's a much more thorough set of data. And now we can just be nimble and make modifications that can have a positive impact on our reliability and on-time performance, which then leads to better schedules for both our riders as well as our operators for their work assignments. So across the board, I think the lesson learned was, you can be hesitant with tech and do your due diligence, do your testing, but then it's kind of changing the gears and making sure we have a process in place to utilize this moving forward, and not just a one and done.
Yeah, and for my perspective, since we've been able to, outside of just the runtime module, but the Swiftly dashboard itself, we've been able to get, I think, 8 or 10 different departments across the entire agency to begin using it, and we've kind of started to shift our agency to start to understand data to a much larger extent, and kind of shift how it is we do things, as Tom said, from the anecdote to actually, like, what does the data say? And so it's brought a lot of people kind of up a level and increased a lot of people's understanding as to how we operate our system. And I think made us a stronger agency overall, and made us a more inquisitive agency where we can ask each other more knowledgeable questions, which leads to better discussions and stronger end results for our customers.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Hugely informative every time I talk with you, and I know that your words of wisdom and advice go very far with an audience like this as well. And that brings us to the live Q&A. I see a lot of questions rolling in, so I'm going to do my best to surface the ones that I think will be the most relevant for the group, and we'll dive right in. This is a great one. It's one of my favorites that just popped up. How many revenue hours did you have to add to your pick to get this on-time performance?
Don't remember off the top of my head, but it was close to 0. If anything, it was we were able to more efficiently provide additional service and maybe do a little swap with our revenue versus our deadhead or non-revenue time. But we actually reduced the number of rosters and reduced the number of blocks. I want to say it was 15 blocks and 17 rosters. So we didn't want to, because this was kind of a new process for us, we didn't want to necessarily reblock and modify trips if we had additional time. So we probably could have saved more resources if we did those things, whereas we just added that into layover time for now. So if we saw an overabundance of running time, we can just shift that into layover time and give the operators a little bit more of a break and more recovery for those runs. When it came to revenue hours, it was really a cost-neutral scenario where we didn't have to add any more revenue hours of service.
Thank you, Tom. Some other questions coming in. What did not work when you did this? And are there any lessons learned kind of ahead of anyone else using this tool that the audience can benefit from?
I think it's not necessarily a matter of what didn't work, but just knowing the unknown. One example is, I believe it was 5 or 6 routes that actually went down in on-time performance, but it wasn't because of anything that we had with the data. It was because when we looked at the information for the runtimes with the Swiftly runtime module, this was before there were some major construction projects that came down the pike on those corridors that were essentially mid-pick. So like I said, we used the sample time frame of September and early October. Well, these construction projects started in late November, and we added time. We did some time trials with some of our coaches and added some time, but it was an estimate, and we got those a little wrong. Not only that, adjoining corridors. So we have a couple radials in our or arterials, I should say, that kind of radiate out from downtown, and one of them was blocked. So a lot of traffic then went onto another corridor. So that was kind of an impact that we weren't necessarily anticipating. So we've seen some, OTP go down on those affected corridors. But now that, we have data now with the deviations or with the diversion routes, we can make modifications for summer. So unfortunately, a couple routes we saw decreased OTP, but we'll have that data and be able to improve those schedules for the summer pick and beyond.
Thank you. Another question from the audience. What other cities does MDOT look to for best practices and innovation and inspiration while looking at service planning?
I think it's really about the components. I mean, Baltimore is a unique city in geography and, how we look at our service. I think WMATA and SEPTA are peers that are close by in the Mid-Atlantic area. Of course, we always look at, agencies like New York MTA, New Jersey Transit, from New Jersey, so I have to always give them a shout out. But just looking at kind of bits and pieces. And seeing what works and what doesn't. And part of this whole Baltimore Link, network redesign was establishing processes and guidelines. We're trying to get away from planning by anecdote. And I think that was a lot historically that happened at the agency, where not only where it's elected official or somebody's grandma needs a bus stop and we put that in, but even adding routes, deviations and changing the alignments, and getting back to the process in a data-driven approach and getting away from anecdotes, I think is going to help us out. And looking at a lot of the guidance documents that other peers have, we're able to utilize that and then build in, incorporating the Swiftly runtime module and even the day-to-day, checking operators, making sure they're performing, properly and they're doing the right thing. But yeah, I think it's just taking bits and pieces of what works, considering the conditions that we have. We have, I don't know off the top of my head, but we have some of the worst traffic in the country. So that's something to keep in mind when we're planning for routes. We want to make sure that we're having access to high frequent transit as well. And, working at how we can improve that, how we can reduce dwell time. Like Mike mentioned, with Baltimore Link, we have the dedicated bus lanes, we had TSP. It's a whole system. It's not one thing that might work and might be the fix. It's just putting it all together and having it work for your own agency. So that's why we take bits and pieces of kind of success stories from around the country, and we just see, what works, pilot stuff, and then, establish it if it works. If not, we'll try something else.
Yep.
Another question from the audience. Do you feel restricted by Swiftly's use of the previously defined time bands in the suggested runtimes module?
Again, this is Mike speaking from a non-scheduler perspective. So the previously defined time bands, they're not defined by Swiftly. They basically look at your GTFS and they can tell when you're switching a time band or a runtime, and that's how they can figure out where your time bands are. What's interesting is that since they provide the recommendation within the runtime that the agency sets in their schedule, this actually allows us to potentially be able to identify where time bands aren't working. And so there could be a recommendation that basically says, within this time band, if you run these runtimes, we're thinking you can really still only get 70%. Well, that tells us that there's some variation within that time band that we need to then do some further inspection. Now, while I would love it if maybe Swiftly is working on a feature where you could actually modify a time band and it would pump out a new recommended runtime, that would be fantastic. But until that comes around, that's something that we're actually working on right now. I haven't really told Tom too much yet, but we're trying to look at how we can use the data that we have to look into doing some custom time banding on certain routes to see if we can see some further successes. So yeah, while it is a little bit restricting, it does also provide you a lot of information to further identify issues.
Thanks, Mike. What tips do you have for other agencies hoping to do large schedule changes?
I think it's just, really do your due diligence and work out a process and what resources you have, whether it's in-house staff, consultant staff, and really start to assign roles and responsibilities and kind of think of everything. Again, when we were looking at scheduling, it's not always about the run times per se. So, we wanted to make sure that it was the buses were getting out on time, that we had enough buses, enough operators. It's the full blitz, and bringing other operations departments involved in this process. It's not just the schedule. I know, again, many schedulers that I've talked to from other agencies, we get a lot of flack saying that we're responsible majority for on-time performance, and it's true, but there's so many other operational impacts that it's just, it's a team effort. And when the team is kind of humming along, that's when we can see the gains, because it's not just my department that, made these. Yes, we made the schedules, but it's getting it out on the street. And I think the coordination among departments, and then having your standards, having your SOPs set up, you can always change them. These are always kind of, living documents that we have, but making sure that you have a plan in place moving forward, so that you could document kind of lessons learned, what worked, what didn't work, and move forward with what worked and change up what didn't.
And so we have time for about one, maybe two last questions within the time frame of this webinar. This is a great one. My agency uses trapeze. How do you integrate the suggested run times into your actual schedule?
Manually. We also use trapeze. I should have mentioned that from the onset. And I know that you can get a certain export of SDE, some type of standard exchange export file, but putting it back into trapeze essentially violates their maintenance or their warranty. So what we had to do was essentially take screenshots, and we saved all 300, all 41 routes, all 308 instances of the runtime changes, even more, because we looked at other routes, and like Mike was saying previously, if we didn't see a big jump and there was a lot of variability in that runtime, in that suggested runtime module, we didn't make that change, because why are we going to change an entire schedule for a couple minutes if we're only going to go up a point, a percentage point. But yeah, I think it was just, it's that missing piece that, we just have to manually input it and just make sure that we keep track. Again, we have a QA, QC, and we just have a lot of Google spreadsheets that we're able to track who does what, when it's changed, then we can verify. But there is no automated process as of yet. So that's still a manually intensive process. But again, with the analysis, being completed, then it's, taking the screenshots and inputting it into Swiftly. And I know Swiftly is also working on, with suggestions that we made, is having a print-friendly version, so we can make PDF copies and not just have to use like Snagit or Snippet for screen grabs. So I think that's going to be a good improvement moving forward, is getting something that you can just print and be able to have this one pager of the run times, so then you can just look at it compared to the trapeze runtime window and add it in there.
Wonderful. And one more big question for you all. Was there any negative feedback from passengers about the proposed changes prior to the new pick?
Well, I mean, passengers are always going to be negative and positive with you. So we track the amount of feedback, social media interactions that we have with our customers. And since the pick, we've actually seen a slightly reduced amount of complaints about on-time performance. And so, it's pretty early yet, but that's probably, that's probably a positive. And so I know Tom's actually spoken with some of the operators, and they had some thoughts about what the new schedules are. I don't know if you want to jump in that.
Yeah, I mean, this was probably one of the first times in my 3 years here that I heard nothing but good things about the schedules. Operators had no complaints. And the very few complaints that I did hear about schedules and runtime, ironically enough, it was when a trip straddled a time band. So if there was a trip that, we have an early morning up until 6 a.m. and then our AM peak starts at 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. So this one operator had a trip that started at 5:55. So it still was assigned the early morning run times, but it was really getting into the meat of the AM peak. And that's just a product of the time banding issue that we're, looking to address. But we looked at his one trip and he had enough layover recovery time. So yeah, he was late on that one trip by, 7 to 10 minutes or 8 to 10 minutes, but he was able to recover. And then his other trips were fine. So if we're getting to that level of scrutiny and detail, I'm fine with that. If it's getting down to that trip level, this one trip is late. That's just unfortunately how our time bands work. And I will take those comments all day. Compared to the old way of, change all the run times, they're all garbage, nothing works. If we're getting into the nitpicky trip level stuff, we can address those.
Great, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure talking with both of you. So we obviously didn't get to all of the questions that people were asking. They're fantastic questions. And so just a note to the participants that we will follow up with answers to those questions. So they're not just going into the ether. Give us a minute to parse through those and put together some well-informed responses for you all. But I also have this slide up here. If you'd like to learn more, go ahead to goswift.ly. That's our website. And we'll also be following up via email to all of the participants here today with some interesting next steps. And like I said, answers to those questions. On behalf of everyone who joined, again, Michael and Tom, thank you so much. You're wise and you're doing amazing things. It's a pleasure working with you. I'm sure you'll get some questions directly after this as well. I did want to close out with an answer to a very brief question, and that is, lastly, what's on your wall, Meredith? And I'm so glad you asked. I'm here in my pseudo sound booth, and I thought you might think it was interesting wallpaper, but this is actually sticky things that allow us to soundproof this room really quickly for calls. So we have these foam boards that I can stick on the wall. We took them off for the book. So that's what's on my wall. Thank you, everybody. Again, we're recording this and we'll follow up via email. It was a pleasure.
Thanks.
Great, thanks.